Okay, so for the first one we're going to do wet in wet. So just using a brush with pure water, we're going to wet the area first. You want to work fairly quickly with a wet in wet. Now I'm going to apply some of my paint. I'm just going to use one of these small palettes. I'm going to stick with mine to be all blue so that you can see. And if I just touch inside the wet areas, you can see that it will bleed. I can fill a lot, and I can also colour mix as well. So if I used a bit of another blue from another palette, I can allow areas to mix more, and I can still leave areas of white. So to create a flat wash, we want to wet our brush and apply with some paint. We don't want to have it too wet on paper, but wet enough, and we want our paintbrush strokes to go all the same direction. So we get a nice even, very, very light and gentle with the paintbrush, so we get a nice even flat wash. To get a graded wash, we're going to go, it's like an ombre effect, so we're going to go from dark to light. So we're going to apply quite a bit of paint onto the paintbrush on dry paper, and then all I'm going to do is wet my paintbrush with water. So I'm cleaning it, wiping slightly on the paint pot, and now I'm going to drag that water down. Now if that jumps too much from dark to light, I can apply a little bit more paint, and again adding a little bit more water, but really controlling the amount of water that you have. But the aim is for it to gradually go from dark to light. Okay, so to create a dry brush effect, if you've already got a wet paintbrush like mine, just dry it off, dry it on the newspaper on your table, or get a paper towel and just dry it off. You still have to have enough water to get the watercolour to actually activate, but you want it to still be fairly dry. And the idea is, this might be still too wet, this brush, which it is. So the other thing you can do is with the palette, like I have here, is already wet with a fair bit of water. And I can use more of a pushing brush. Remember, these ones are the ones that are on a top shelf that are really coarse hair. And I can tap that into the paint, and you can see where you can see it just dry on the bristles, just here. And then I can create a sort of hairy texture. So it adds texture, creating dry brush effect. You can also do this with layering some colour. So if I tap into some of my other blue, I can still create some really nice layering, but it's particularly good for texture. You can also scumble, which is to go around in circles with your brush. And again, you'd only do this with one of these pushing brushes. You'd never do it with one of our soft Taklon brushes, but only the coarse hair ones that can withstand this. So again, nice dry brush into just a bit of paint that's got a little bit of water there, and then you create that dry brush effect. Okay, so to create sgraffito, which is like the you do with oil pastels as well. You can also do with paint, with acrylic or watercolour. Works probably best with the thicker paints, but you can do it with watercolour. So get a nice thick layer of paint down first, quite a bit of paint. Work fairly quickly. And maybe mix in a bit of this other blue. And then once you have that layer of paint down, you can use the other end of your paintbrush, and you can scratch in and create marks. So you can see it's quite subtle when you're using watercolour, as opposed to when using acrylic paint, which you'll get much bolder results because of the thicker layer of the paint. Watercolours are very thin paint and washes, and therefore that's where you get that thinner sort of look. But you can see it's quite nice where you get two colours, or two tones rather, of colour bleeding into each other. Just be gentle with your paper, otherwise you'll find that you will go through the paper, as it's quite delicate when it adds on the water. Okay, so for salt, what you need to do is work fairly quickly. You need to lay down your colour, and as you can see, I've got nice and glossy, it's lots of water there. So before it dries, it's important you have your salt ready to go. next to you before, because if it dries it won't work. This is rock salt, so it's really chunky salt. And then we've also got the table salt, which is a thinner salt, which will create a sort of more delicate look. And you can see even in this area, you can see here it's already starting to dry, so it's not going to suck up the paint as much as in this wetter area here. So when you've left that to dry, it will then, the salt over time as it dries will suck up that paint, and when it's dry you'll be left with a really nice effect. Once it's completely dry you can then wipe the salt off, but while it's drying you need to leave the salt completely still, careful not to knock it. Now you can see the salt one has dried. I've rubbed off all the salt and you can see that there's been a pattern left behind. There's some more salt left on. And you can see the patterns that are left behind where the salt has sucked up the paint. So the sponge one, just using a small sponge, you can wet the end of the sponge into some water and then apply it to the paint. You can decide how much you want to have. Dabbing, you can sort of pull the sponge as well, you can twist, and you can also still layer with your different colours. Again, really good for texture, just like the dry brush one. Okay, so for masking, there's two ways of masking. Masking is basically blanking off an area of paper to leave it white. So you can use regular masking tape for this. We can cut areas, so we can cut more like geometric shapes and stick these down. And we can also tear shapes. You could tear long lines. If you want more of a rough edge, you can create larger or smaller shapes as well. And you could also overlap as well to create blocked out sections. The other way is to use masking fluid like this. And to do this, you need to find yourself a really old brush. So the brushes that we have on the top shelves, you want to find the oldest, firmest brush that there is up there, because the brush is like sort of painting like with glue, if you will. So when you've used this, you want to wash the brush out really quickly. So you're working with what looks like white on white. And then you leave that to dry. So as soon as you pop the drawing fluid, masking fluid away, go and give your brush a really quick wash and then leave that to dry before painting. Now that the masking fluid has dried, we can apply our watercolour paint over the top of our masking fluid and masking tape. Now with the masking fluid, you need to leave it completely to dry before you rub it off, and you basically use your finger like an eraser to rub it off. But with the masking tape, when you're using acrylic paint, it's best to take it off when it's wet, but with watercolour, you really need to leave it to dry, otherwise you're going to have more wet paint flooding into those areas. So let's leave it all to dry, and then we'll come back when it's dry to take all that masking tape and fluid off. Now that the masking, the paint over the top of the masking tape and fluid is all dry, we can now carefully peel this one off. As you're peeling off the paper, just be really gentle, as you find that because it's stuck on for a long time, it can well peel the paper. So really gentle, just finding the corner, peeling it really slowly. And then with the masking fluid, You can sort of, if you find it doesn't rub easily with your finger, you can just sort of, use your nail or pick the side, and then you should be able to rub it with your finger. So sometimes that's it. It takes a while, but you sort of use your finger like an eraser. So obviously with the masking fluid, you're able to get a lot finer lines. And it's just wipe off into the bin. So that's masking. Okay, so wax resist is using wax crayons. You can also do this method with oil pastels, works as well. But using wax crayons, I've just kept it with blue and with white for you to see the difference. But applying fairly firm pressure, you can create all sorts of drawing. You could, whatever your shapes, your lines are that your drawing is. But just remember that you need to do nice firm pressure. You can also work with white. If you don't put enough pressure on, you'll find that the resist doesn't work as well. But once you've done your drawings in the wax crayon, then you go to put your paint over the top. Again, sticking with some blue. And as you can see that the wax repels the paint, leaving it as a resist. And there you can see the white comes to life. And that's a wax resist. Okay, so PVA glue works a little bit like masking in that you can create lines with PVA glue, leave them to dry, and then create a resist or an embossed look. When you're using these little squeezy bottles, you'll find that the glue dries on quite will block the top. So you just need to sort of prepare the nib of it first, just to clear it off first. And if it feels like there's no air coming out, it's blocked, if you just get a paper clip and just give that a little push down, like this one, give it a wiggle, and then you should be good to draw. You can do dots. You don't want to go too thick, too crazy. You can also do lines. Good if you want lots of sort of raised texture, and then leave that to dry. It does take quite a long time to dry before you're going to be able to paint onto it. Okay, so now the PVA glue, as you can see, has really dried. We can go over with our paint. So I'm grabbing some paint. And this one, the PVA glue stays on, so you actually leave this as this one. You don't pull this one off like the masking. This one just stays on as some texture that's underneath the paint. For glad wrap, you need to have your piece of glad wrap ready to go, and have it, you don't need it that big, just the size to cover the square that you're going to be painting over, and have it flat ready to go. When you're applying your paint, have it nice and wet. You don't want it dry. Nice and puddly with water. And then you want to apply it down quite quickly. The more scrunchy it is, the more textured it will be. And you can see that where those marks are now will be where it leaves those marks, and you need to leave that on there while it dries, leave it undisturbed, and you can leave the plastic on there while it goes on the drying rack. And then when it's all dry, you better peel that off, and all those marks will be left behind on the paint. Now that the watercolour underneath the glad wrap has dried, I can peel this off, and we're left behind with this really nice texture inside of our watercolour.